In 1999 in Lancaster, California, 20-year-old African-American Calvin Wright lived with his 67-year-old grandfather, Oliver Wright. Calvin's parents, Edna and Leroy, died in a car accident in 1993 when he was 14. Oliver became his sole guardian. Calvin was withdrawn but friendly with a small social circle. Oliver, a former mechanic, lived on a pension and rarely left the house. In early 1999, Oliver's behavior changed. He became overly attentive to Calvin, calling him several times a day to ask where he was and who he was with. If Calvin was late, Oliver would show up at his location and wait for him. Calvin's co-worker, 22-year-old Sheila Thompson, once noticed Oliver watching him through the window. Calvin dismissed this as care and didn't pay attention. By May, Oliver was following Calvin almost everywhere, asking about his personal life and plans. Calvin began to feel pressured, but he did not want to confront him, appreciating his grandfather's support after his parents' death. In June he discovered that his phone, left at home, was unlocked with messages to Sheila open. Oliver explained that he had checked his calls, but Calvin became suspicious. By August, Oliver had become even more persistent. He bought Calvin clothes, insisting that he wear them, and gave him an expensive watch, saying that it symbolized family. Calvin began to avoid long conversations, feeling uncomfortable. Oliver, not noticing this, continued to call and follow him. In September, when Oliver was again waiting for Calvin outside, Calvin noticed a strange warmth in his gaze, causing discomfort. Sheila advised him to talk to his grandfather, but Calvin hesitated, afraid of offending him. By October 1999, Grandpa's behavior toward his grandson was becoming increasingly obsessive. Oliver not only watched Calvin's every move, but also began to show attention that went beyond family care. Calvin, accustomed to the role of an obedient grandson, initially saw nothing unusual in this, but the events of the autumn began to change his perception. Oliver began touching Calvin more often, adjusting his clothes, lingering his hand on his shoulder longer than necessary, or lightly touching his face to brush away a speck of dust that didn't exist. These gestures were accompanied by lingering glances that Calvin began to notice. One evening when they were having dinner together, Oliver took Calvin's hand, squeezing it with unexpected force, and told him that he was the most important thing in his life. Calvin, embarrassed, attributed this to his grandfather's age and loneliness, but an inner sense of unease was growing. In November, Oliver began leaving notes for Calvin. They would appear on the kitchen table or in his jacket pocket. The notes would say things like, "You're always on my mind," or "We're together forever." Calvin would read them with a mixture of awkwardness and affection, thinking that his grandfather was simply trying to express his love. He didn't share this with Sheila Thompson, his colleague, although she noticed that Calvin had become even more withdrawn. One day Sheila asked if everything was okay at home, but Calvin just nodded, avoiding details. By the end of November, Oliver's behavior had become overtly intimate. One day when Calvin came home late, Oliver met him in the living room with the lights dim. There was a bottle of wine on the table, which was unusual since Oliver rarely drank. He invited Calvin to have a drink together, calling it a special moment. Calvin, not wanting to offend his grandfather, agreed. As they talked, Oliver moved closer, placing his hand on Calvin's knee, and began to talk about how much he valued their closeness. He called Calvin, "the only person who understands me." Calvin felt his heart beat faster, not with joy but with a vague fear. After a few days, Oliver became more overt. He began hugging Calvin longer than usual, pressing his whole body against him. One night, after Calvin had gone to bed, Oliver came into his room and sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at Calvin in the dark without saying a word, and then quietly said, "You know how much I love you." Calvin, feigning sleep, did not respond, but his thoughts were confused. He began to ask questions, but the fear of hurting his grandfather was too much. By December, the relationship between them had taken on a romantic edge that Calvin couldn't quite comprehend. Oliver began to express his feelings openly. He gave Calvin gifts like a ring engraved with their initials, and insisted that he wear it. During one dinner, Oliver took Calvin's hand and kissed his fingers, looking into his eyes. Calvin, stunned, didn't know how to react. He felt indebted to Oliver for his years of caring, and part of him wanted to believe that this was just an unusual form of love. He began to convince himself that maybe it was normal for his grandfather to be so attached to him. Sheila, noticing the change in Calvin's behavior, tried to question him. He admitted that his grandfather had become too close, but he did not go into detail. Sheila suggested that he talk to someone else, perhaps a counselor, but Calvin refused, afraid of betraying Oliver. He still saw Oliver as the only person close to him, despite his growing discomfort. By the end of the year, Oliver had become even more insistent. He began asking Calvin to sleep in the same room, claiming that they would be closer to each other. Calvin, unable to refuse, sometimes agreed but tried to keep his distance. Oliver, however, did not back down. He continued to talk about his love, calling Calvin his everything. Calvin, confused and at a loss, began to feel that he was losing control of his life. He could not explain why he was agreeing to such a relationship, but the fear of loneliness and the sense of duty to his grandfather held him back. By January 2000, the relationship between 20-year-old Calvin Wright and his 67-year-old grandfather Oliver Wright had reached a frightening point. Oliver, whose care for his grandson had turned into a romantic obsession, had become even more controlling. Calvin, bound by a sense of duty and a fear of being alone, could find no way to stop his grandfather, even as his anxiety grew worse with each passing day. Oliver began to show physical intimacy that went beyond the familial. He would often take Calvin's hand, lingering in his touch, or stroke his back, calling it caring. In the evenings, he insisted on long dinner conversations in which he spoke of their special connection. One day in early January, Oliver put his arm around Calvin, holding him close, and whispered that he was the only one he needed. Calvin, stunned, did not respond, but he felt a sense of awkwardness creeping up on him. By February, Oliver had begun to control every aspect of Calvin's life. He forbade him from communicating with Sheila Thompson, Calvin's co-worker, claiming that she was trying to break them up. When Calvin objected, Oliver raised his voice, accusing him of being ungrateful for years of care. One day, Calvin noticed that his phone left on the table had been checked. Messages with Sheila were open. Oliver admitted that he was looking for proof of betrayal, but Calvin, fearing confrontation, remained silent. Oliver began to insist on sleeping together. He would come into Calvin's room late at night, sit on the bed and talk about his love. One night, he lay down next to Calvin, claiming he wanted to be closer. Calvin, paralyzed by the fear of hurting his grandfather, did not object but lay awake, feeling trapped. In the morning, Oliver acted as if this was normal, calling Calvin his. Calvin began to avoid his grandfather's gaze, but did not know how to stop it. In March, Oliver became even more outspoken. He gave Calvin a silver ring with their initials on it and insisted that he wear it at all times. When Calvin took the ring off one day, Oliver noticed and made a scene, accusing him of not appreciating their love. Calvin began wearing the ring to appease his grandfather, but he felt increasingly depressed. Oliver also began buying him clothes, choosing tight shirts and jeans that he said brought out his good looks. Calvin couldn't refuse, fearing his grandfather's reaction. Sheila, seeing that Calvin had become withdrawn, tried to talk to him. He admitted that Oliver was too close to him, but refused to discuss the details. Sheila suggested that he leave home, but Calvin said he couldn't abandon his grandfather, who had raised him after his parents died. He felt obligated, despite his growing fear. By the end of March, Oliver had started talking about a future together. He mentioned that they could leave Lancaster and start anew. He called Calvin his forever, and insisted on physical intimacy. One evening, Oliver tried to kiss Calvin on the lips, but Calvin pulled away. Oliver, noticing his reaction, said that Calvin needed time to understand their love. Calvin, shocked, began to lock the door to his room, but Oliver knocked, demanding that he open it. Calvin found Oliver going through his personal belongings. His old letters and photographs had been moved and some were missing. When he asked about it, Oliver said he was cleaning up, but Calvin noticed that his grandfather had taken to keeping photographs of him in his room. This increased his suspicions, but he didn't know how to confront Oliver. Calvin felt like his life wasn't his own, but fear of loneliness and guilt kept him in the house. By April 2000, the situation at the boy's home with his grandfather had reached a critical point. Oliver, whose obsession with his grandson had become all-consuming, had taken over his grandson's life. Calvin, exhausted by the pressure and sense of duty, found himself trapped, with no way out. His internal conflict between fear and affection for his grandfather grew stronger with each passing day. Oliver became even more controlling. He demanded that Calvin spend all his free time with him, forbidding him to leave the house without permission. If Calvin tried to leave, Oliver would follow him, sometimes showing up at places he frequented without warning. One day, Calvin spotted his grandfather standing across the street while he was talking to Sheila Thompson after work. Oliver later explained that he was just passing by, but Calvin realized that he was being followed. He stopped sharing details with Sheila, afraid that Oliver would find out about their conversations. Oliver's physical closeness became unbearable. He insisted on long hugs, often holding Calvin so tightly that Calvin could not move. During one dinner, Oliver grabbed Calvin's face, looked him in the eyes and said that, "No one will love him the way I do." Calvin, disgusted, tried to pull away, but Oliver squeezed his wrist, demanding that he not push love away. Calvin began to avoid dinner together, but Oliver knocked on his door, demanding that he come out. Oliver also increased his control over Calvin's personal belongings. He took away his house keys, claiming it was for safety. Calvin discovered that his letters and photographs related to his parents were missing from a box. When he asked about it, Oliver said he kept them in a safe place. Calvin noticed that his grandfather had begun wearing a locket around his neck with a photograph of Calvin that Calvin had never given him. This discovery made Calvin feel as if his identity was being erased. In May, Oliver became even more outspoken about his intentions. He began talking about a marriage of souls, claiming that he and Calvin were meant for each other. One night, he entered Calvin's room without knocking and attempted to climb into his bed, repeating that it was their destiny. Calvin, in a panic, shouted for his grandfather to leave, but Oliver just laughed, calling him stubborn. Calvin then began barricading the door with furniture, but Oliver found ways to get into the room, claiming he was checking to see if everything was okay. Sheila, the only person Calvin still had contact with, noticed his deteriorating condition. He looked exhausted, spoke quietly, and avoided eye contact. When she once again suggested that he leave the house, Calvin admitted that he was afraid of Oliver's reaction. He told her how his grandfather had threatened to do something to himself if Calvin left him. Sheila insisted that he seek help, but Calvin refused, not wanting to betray his only relative. By the end of May, Oliver had begun to manipulate Calvin by exploiting his guilt. He often brought up the death of Calvin's parents, saying that he was the only one left to protect him. He gave Calvin a new phone, but set it up so that all calls and texts would go through his control. Calvin found that he could not send a message to Sheila without Oliver finding out. When he tried to object, Oliver burst into tears, accusing Calvin of wanting to break up their family. Calvin began to feel like he was losing himself. He stopped sleeping, afraid that Oliver would come into his room. His thoughts were confused. He hated his grandfather for pressuring him, but at the same time he felt guilty for these thoughts. Oliver, oblivious or ignorant of Calvin's condition, continued to act as if their relationship was normal. He left notes with confessions, calling Calvin his soulmate, and insisted on walking together, holding his hand in public. Calvin, unable to resist, complied, but his despair grew. By June 2000, Calvin Wright was completely dependent on his 67-year-old grandfather, Oliver. Oliver, whose obsession with his grandson had reached an extreme, controlled every aspect of his life. Calvin, tortured by pressure and guilt, had lost all hope of liberation. His world had shrunk to the walls of his home, where Oliver dictated the rules of their special relationship. Oliver became even more controlling. He forbade Calvin to leave the house without him, claiming that the outside world is dangerous. When Calvin tried to leave, Oliver would follow him or lock the door, claiming it was for his own good. Calvin stopped communicating with Sheila Thompson as Oliver confiscated his phone, replacing it with a device that monitored all calls. Calvin felt completely isolated. Oliver's physical closeness became unbearable. He insisted on nightly talks, in which he would hug Calvin or try to lie next to him. One night in early June, Oliver entered Calvin's room and tried to kiss him, ignoring Calvin's protests. Calvin, in despair, pushed his grandfather away, but Oliver only smiled, saying that he'll get used to it soon. Calvin began to dread going to sleep, afraid that Oliver would violate his boundaries again. Oliver continued to manipulate Calvin by reminding him of his parents' deaths. He said that only he could protect him, and accused Calvin of being ungrateful if he resisted. He gave Calvin a bracelet engraved with the words, "Together Forever," and demanded that he never take it off. Calvin, exhausted, complied, but his mental state worsened. He stopped eating and looked haggard. In mid-June, Calvin reached his breaking point. He tried to talk to Oliver, begging him to stop, but his grandfather took it as a betrayal. Oliver burst into tears, threatening that he couldn't live without Calvin. This scene finally broke Calvin. He felt that there was no way out. He couldn't leave, afraid to leave his grandfather alone, but staying in the house was unbearable. On June 27, 2000, Calvin was found dead in his room. Lancaster police found his body with a note in which he had written, "I can't take it anymore." The death was initially classified as a suicide caused by mental illness. Oliver, posing as a grieving grandfather, told police that Calvin had been suffering from depression after the death of his parents. Sheila, upon learning of the tragedy, reported Oliver's strange behavior to investigators, but her words did not arouse suspicion. However, upon further investigation, police found evidence that pointed to Oliver's involvement. A journal was found in his room in which he described his love for Calvin and plans to keep him forever. Entries were also found that hinted at his role in the car crash that killed Calvin's parents in 1993. Investigators began to suspect that Oliver had orchestrated their deaths in order to gain control of Calvin.